Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It is episode 2586 of The Tom Woods Show, and we have Carl Benjamin with us, director of LotusEaters.com. Carl, I didn't check, but we've spoken on this show a long time ago, but it was like a long time ago. I've been doing this for 11 years. So I don't know how long it's been, but I think you are, I wouldn't say you're a different person than you were in those days, but I think your thinking might have evolved a little bit. And so I thought there were a bunch of things that you and I might talk about, but all the same, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So you're over there in the UK. Now that itself leads to a series of questions. What it's like being a dissident in the UK. Because just when we feel like in the US we have it bad, then I get complaints from my friends in the UK saying, oh, geez, I wish we had the strength, of a dissident voices that you guys have. But first, how would you describe your politics?
I don't really have a label for it. There's an emerging space that I guess is just being called post-liberal, where it's filled with people who were previously liberals of some stripe, but have realized that liberalism itself is actually the problem with modern day politics, the construction of the philosophy of liberalism. And many of them have actually spent a lot of time studying liberalism right to its original philosophical foundations, myself included, and found that this doesn't really make sense. And so something has to come after it, because actually the trajectory liberalism puts us on is good at the beginning, but it ends in a place that's very undesirable. And we're actually arriving at that undesirable place right now. And so best to do something else rather than continue to be liberals. So I haven't really got a name for what I am, but I try not to be ideological at this point. I think the nature of ideology itself is the problem. And it's something that we should essentially repudiate, because it drives us down the path of nonsensible politics. And what I mean by nonsensible is politics that doesn't have anything to do with the information our senses are giving us about the world. California is a superb example of this, with homelessness and drug use. A sensible position is we have to do something about the homelessness and drug use. And the ideological liberal position is, yes, we need to make sure they've got clean needles. And that's not the answer, actually. That's not humane. That's not good. But that is liberal. That's a very liberal perspective, because as far as they're concerned, the person chooses to use drugs or is a victim of the drugs themselves. And those things are both valid, and the idea of making them stop using drugs is not really valid. In fact, they might say on a personal level, well, I find that undesirable, but really we should intervene and simply prevent them from getting drugs, force them to go to treatment centers until they're clean and back on their feet. It's not kind to just make sure they've got clean needles, for example. And it's those kinds of problems that liberalism has created that it has no answers to, that shows that it is not a comprehensive philosophy for human life, let alone for what the problems we face now. Because the problems we face now are the success of liberalism. They're the outgrowth of liberalism. We didn't face them before because we didn't have such an advanced version of this philosophy controlling everything that we do. And so that's the position I found myself in.
So would you say that also maybe the reason we hadn't seen it in such a degenerate form is that we were still operating a little bit on borrowed time, and that we still had some Christian inheritance, we had some tradition of acting like civilized people that was left over for a long time, and those were the fumes, and you can still kind of putt along a little bit on the fumes, but now we don't have even the fumes.
Yeah, I think that's a good characterization of the problem, especially as the kind of old traditional morality that infused our civilization in almost every layer of the civilization was just always there, and it was never really properly identified, but it was always something, like your grandmother would, when you were being told off by your grandmother, it was more impactful than being told off by like a teacher or something, because she would pull on something deep and personal and sentimental in the back of your mind. And she would have language that we actually don't really use too much now to make you feel ashamed of the thing that you were doing. And all of this has been thinned out, and this kind of moral color to the world has kind of drained out at this point. So now we have essentially what is sort of contractual morality, and that's not sufficient for all of the things that happen in the world. And that doesn't help us actually deal with those problems and explain why we've got to this point. For example, the recent drama or scandal about the woman who slept with 100 men a day.
I saw your video on that.
Yeah, the liberals can't find the problem with that, because they say, well, they all consented to it. They all signed forms for it. So there's nothing morally objectionable about this, but she herself could feel there was something morally objectionable about it by the fact that she cried at the end of it. Everyone can tell this is not normal, this is not healthy. And actually, there is a non-liberal morality that used to fill this moral space, and we used to be able to pull on that when we wanted to explain why this was something wrong, even if we couldn't rationally explain why it was wrong. It was still a felt emotion. And without that, we arrive at a point where essentially all manner of degenerate behaviors are considered to be the moral equivalents of virtuous behaviors. And actually, that's not correct. And everyone knows that's not correct. And we need to start reclaiming that, basically.
That grandmother example you gave is interesting to me, because maybe 20 years ago, when a lot of the older people you would see walking around did actually have some experience living in a semi-civilized society. And I would walk around and see them, and I would think to myself, I'm sorry you had to live to see it this way. And not all of us young people are dolts who think you're just old and stupid. Like, I think you're old and smart.
One thing, I mean, the other way of looking at that is, well, you are the people who brought us to this place.
I know.
So,
I mean, some of the, right.
Yeah.
No, I'm thinking I'm thinking in particular, because for the longest time I've gone to the old Latin Mass, and so the people there are the ones who they fought every step of modernity. They've done everything they can to cling to the old ways, and I just feel like, geez, I'm sorry, because yes, I know. Then I think about the people. Again, I'm thinking only in terms of church, but I think of people sitting in the modern pew who let every sacred thing be taken right out from under their noses. I don't feel the same sense of sorrow for them, because they don't even see what's been taken from them. But I see what you. No, but let's.
I think you've got a good point there. They are old and wise, I think, is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
Because wisdom, one of the core components of wisdom is time. And this is something that we forget in the modern world, is that you can't become wise without your share of years in the world.
Yeah.
It's just not possible. You can be very smart, you can be very technically well-read, but if you don't know how to apply the knowledge you've gained and the things that you've learned, then you're not wise. And that's just something you have to wait for. And I remember being young and thinking, well, that sounds really stupid. And now I'm not young. I look back and go, wow, I was really ignorant. And I'm sure that everyone who gets to sort of our sort of age has exactly that experience of life.
I look back at some of the articles I wrote, in college publications when I was 21, speaking as someone who had no experience with anything, but yet I felt entitled to an opinion on every topic under the sun because I was 21 and I had read the books my professors told me to read. And now, see, at least though, I was spared the world of social media, because at least my dumb rantings are now in some old publications collecting dust in the university library. They're not all over Twitter and Facebook and wherever. And now we have not so much bloggers anymore, because blogs are kind of passé, but we have all these, I don't know, opinion molders and celebritarians or whatever, who are in their early 20s pontificating on things they couldn't possibly have a real grasp on. And I believe me, I hear the old man in me as I say these things, but old men are right sometimes. And I think it's a matter of when you're that age, you need to read more than you need to write. You need to learn more than you need to pontificate.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely correct. I think old men are right more often than I've ever been able to give them credit for when I was a young man.
Yeah.
But the thing is, a lot of it really is you have to learn it for yourself. There's only so much wisdom you can really imbibe from someone else until you're not making your own decisions, you're not making your own mistakes. So I'm not too harsh on young people who think they know it all.
But we've all been there, of course. But I guess what I want to know then is, you would definitely say, or would you say, that in those early Sargon videos that we all recall, that you would still have thought of yourself as some form of liberal in those days? Is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
So what was it? Was there one moment or one issue that made you say, this is the ideology I've attached myself to is not compatible with a kind of life that I think is worth defending? What happened?
There was no one incident, but there's been a gradual erosion of the sort of collective identity of the people of the West in each of their countries. And you see a consistent undermining of what it is to be an American, what it is to be an Englishman, what it is to be a Frenchman, etc., etc. And this is a kind of natural thing for liberalism to do, because it doesn't really accept that human beings are designed to live in a civilization. Liberalism conceives of people as existing in a theoretical and false pre-social existence in what they call the state of nature. And so they have a sort of theoretical, abstract, universal human type in their minds. And so when you say, well, I'm a particular type of person from a particular place, particular time, from a particular culture, the liberal doesn't recognize that, because the individual is the beginning of what they view as the political and moral universe. But of course, that doesn't ever apply to anyone. No one is born in isolation on an island or something away from all other humans. And so there is no abstract universal human. All humans are particular and born in cultures and times and places, to families and communities and education systems surrounded by various institutions with a big, long cultural inheritance that is embedded into everything that they do without them knowing it. This is something that the Marxists called ideology. And it's in everything, sort of like in an Althuserian way. Everything that you have is a product of the worldview of the civilization that you've been born and raised in. So the liberal idea of a universal pre-social man is just nonsense. It doesn't exist. And so actually the beginning building block of society actually isn't the individual, because the individual is never in isolation. It's always the individual in relation to other people around him, what we would call the society. And so it's not that we need to be collectivist or anything like that. But what we should do is have a more rich understanding of what it is to be a person in the real world. And liberalism has a very abstract and unreal version of what it is to be a person in an abstract and unreal world. And so until we can redefine these terms into something that's more realistic and actually more applicable to a human life, we're going to find ourselves essentially at the mercy of liberalism's desire to break the bonds between humans, because liberalism believes that man went into a society out of his own free will. And so everything about the liberal morality is fundamentally consent-based, as in the only things that choose and decide between right and wrong are whether you personally agree to this or not. But that's not true. And everyone knows that's not true. You didn't choose your parents, but you still know you have moral obligations to them. You still know that you love them. You don't choose where you live, but you still have a moral obligation to your neighbor to not mess up the lawn or something like this. All of these things contain, and everyone understands them to contain, huge amounts of moral content. And yet liberalism is blind to all of this. And that's why, in fact, it needs the social contract. So it's like, right, okay, the state is going to impose a series of rules upon you, and everyone's going to follow these rules, and then we'll have peace and harmony. And the thing is, that only works until it doesn't, where you have some raging lunatic on the subway who's like, oh, is this guy following the social contract? Is this guy, or is he a nutter who's going to start doing some crazy stuff? And then you get a Daniel Penny situation where someone in the old morality is like, well, I'm a man, I can do something about this. I have an obligation to other people around me to do something about this, and I don't get to choose that. A man on a subway when there's a crazed guy threatening women around, yeah, you've got a moral obligation to intervene. This isn't liberal. This isn't the social contract. And what's nice about the Daniel Penny scenario is that the social contract would actually, like the left has been trying to do, stigmatize him for this. It's like, well, it wasn't your job. You weren't authorized to do that. There was no consent given by society. You took an executive action of your own and something terrible happened. And so now you're going to be punished for it. And that's what they want. But the traditional perspective is, well, no, he was a man. He had an obligation to step in, and he did. And that's why everyone's celebrating the fact that he was let out, because he did the right thing, even though there was a tragic end to it, but it was still the right thing for him to do.
Parents concerned about your children's education, traditional schooling not cutting it? We have a solution. Welcome to the Plumley Pod, your voice of reason for home education. Hosted by Sarah Plumley, head teacher at Gorilla Ed and UK National Examiner of Mathematics for over a decade. Mrs. Plumley's Rescue Your Children course is designed to ensure you navigate home education with confidence and ease. Craft a genuinely bespoke curriculum, uncover effective teaching strategies, and ignite your child's inner desire to learn. Ready to take back control of your child's education? Tune into the Plumley Pod and sign up for Rescue Your Children. Visit sarahplumley.substack.com to learn more. That's Plumley, Plumley. As Mrs. Plumley says, your children can either be educated or schooled, and these things are mutually exclusive. Choose education. It's time to rescue your children. Visit sarahplumley.substack.com.
And anyway, so that's basically my main problem with liberalism is it's a very myopic and narrow perspective on what a human being is. And I think I've just wandered far off the question at this point.
No, but that's a perfectly good and interesting and stimulating answer. Incidentally, in my opinion, social contract theory itself is a mess because it seems like it's derived from the liberal idea that all authorities have to, in some, because they are so uncomfortable with the idea of authority, that authority has to somehow come from me. I must be the source of that authority. Now, how could that be? Well, there must have been some primordial moment when we all gathered, and even hypothetically, we would have gathered. If we were all thinking straight, we would have gathered and said we are delegating certain powers to some central thing. Well, even John Locke acknowledges that, well, this is impractical. There's no way we could get every single person. It's the impracticality of it. And also there would occasionally be recalcitrant people who just wouldn't go along. So we're just going to say that, well, of course, if you were in your right mind, you would consent to this because this is the way we all need to live. So even on their own terms, these social contract theories are a total logical mess. Then a second thing about what you said. So I can imagine being within the liberal tradition and saying, I do believe that human beings are not just interchangeable atoms. And I do believe that is a very, very impoverished way of thinking. I just personally happen to think that the institution of the state is so destructive that it destroys and undermines all these little things that create our identities. Like, for instance, when we think about Italian unification, well, there was a big difference between being a Piedmontese and a Sicilian. But Italian unification didn't want to hear anything about that. They want you to be an Italian. So that's a case where the state actually undermines the things that go to make up our social identities. And that's why I have a suspicion toward it, not because because I'm some kind of nihilist or something. It's not that. It's that I don't trust the institution. Second thing I want to say is Murray Rothbard was Mr. Libertarian, but the year before he died, he wrote a very interesting article called Nations by Consent, and he was entertaining the subject of immigration. And he said that it occurred to him that very easily you could take some small society, maybe Singapore. I don't know how many million people live in Singapore, but not that many. And if I brought enough people from a completely alien culture, just dropped them there, the culture of Singapore would be destroyed. It would be gone. And he thought, that I don't feel like that could possibly be the humane, like the humane response to that is not, well, you don't own Singaporean culture. Nobody owns it. So I guess it just has to go. And he just said, even if that He didn't put it quite this way, but even if my ideas led that way, I can't imagine that's the humane outcome. That's the humane way to look at this.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, just to work backwards on them then. This is the problem with propositional reasoning when it comes to political and moral problems. When you identify a series of propositions that you are going to logically derive conclusions from, you must necessarily be leaving other things out. Otherwise, your proposition would be far too long for you to ever write down or enunciate. So if you say, right, it's this, and this, well, okay, that's fine. And I'm sure those things are important. But what aren't you considering? And this is the problem with sort of rationalist philosophies of libertarianism in particular, actually, is very pernicious for this kind of thing. But socialism as well, they're very similar in this regard, where they identify one or two things about human life and say, right, we're going to blow them out of proportion and out of their context and apply and advise that that's applied to the entire civilization. And it's not that those things aren't important, right? It's not that, I mean, the socialists are right that the relationship of a person to the means of production actually does matter, right? That's why being a slave is bad. That's not good. That is the question of the relationship between the person, the means of production, and whoever owns the means of production. That is an important relationship. And that's why people... that's why the sort of happiest people are the sort of petty bourgeoisie, who are small business owners who own their own business, and people who work at small businesses. They feel the most invested in what's happening because they're the closest to the ownership and the production itself. So they feel unalienated from it, unlike someone who's just working in a factory and they've got absolutely no control and they're incredibly remote from the people who own the damn thing, and they do just feel alienated in their labor. Fair point. The libertarians are right about the importance of private property rights. Of course they're right about that. Obviously that's correct, but that's not the only thing that matters. And in your example from Rothbard there are dangers in the free market itself, because if the free market, again, if it's a useful tool when it does what we want it to do, when it's considered an end goal in itself and we blow the importance of it out of proportion. I mean, Britain is a superb example on how the free market is going crazy and is essentially selling out our patrimony. So at the moment, we have the highest train fares in Europe. Trains are important in Britain. I don't know. I assume you're in the United States, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Trains are very important in the United States. Cars are important in the United States. Trains are important in Europe because Europe is a sort of old civilization. We've got loads and loads of railway everywhere. And they're generally quite a convenient way to travel. We have the most expensive railway system in Europe because we are subsidizing European railways. Because we, for some reason, were like, okay, we're going to privatize our railways and allow anyone in the world to buy them. Well, who bought them? The Dutch, the Spanish, and the Germans, the Italians. So they have ultra cheap railway fares because we're subsidizing them, because the companies that own their rails own ours as well. And it's just like, that's crazy. So using the train in Britain is more expensive. It's more expensive for me to take a 1-hour train from where I live to London than it is to fly a plane to Barcelona, right? It is cheaper for me to fly to continental Europe than travel 1 hour down a railway line, which is mad. It's totally mad. And it wouldn't be the case were it not that foreign companies own the national infrastructure. Like the Royal Mail is another example. That's being sold off to a Czech billionaire. It's like, why would we want a foreign billionaire to own the Royal Mail's 500 years old. The institution that became what we know now as the modern Royal Mail was founded by like Henry VIII or something. It's like, why would we want this? Why would we sell off what is a part of our heritage to some foreign billionaire or any foreign company who's just going to use it to extract wealth from our country and squeeze us for everything they can get? And then you've got other examples like the free market. It's like a good idea. However, you can say, like the EU, they've got the 4 freedoms. And one of these 4 freedoms is the movement of capital, goods, people, and services, I think it is. Okay, well, the movement of people is actually something that is important. And if it's a core part of the free market, then there is a problem with the free market. Because exactly in your Singapore example, you could say, well, okay, well, Singapore needs the GDP to grow. What's the easiest way to grow the GDP? Well, bring in more people because they are part of the people who produce the gross domestic product. Okay, but what's that going to do to Singapore? Well, that's going to cause property prices to skyrocket. And Singapore's, again, a really good example because it's a tiny island with like 4 million people on it. Okay, well, how are the Singaporeans meant to buy a house when now there are twice as many people on the island who are also looking to buy houses? The price of houses is going sky, and this is exactly what's happened in Britain. When I was, in like 1992, when I was 12, the average price of a house in this country was 4 times the annual salary. It is now about 12 times the annual salary, which means my children will probably never be able to buy their own houses. And what this has been done by is the free market. The free market demanded labor, and now my children can't buy a home. So the question of the concrete property ownership, which the Libertarian began with, has now been abstracted and expanded out of context into the free market, which is preventing my children from property ownership, the thing the free market was meant to facilitate in the first place. And so this is the problem with all ideology, is that it takes an idea, blows it out of its proportion and context, and then tries to apply it without sense, as in without using the data that you can take in from around you. And the abstract commitment to it essentially makes people ignorant and very stupid. And this is a problem.
All right. I'm not familiar with what goes on in the UK as much as somebody who lives there is. I do hear bits and pieces from, friends of mine I told you about before. In the US case, when it comes to housing, I have a friend who is an expert on this and has convinced me that we could, with not particularly wrenching changes, we could actually cut in half the current housing prices just by getting rid of all the restrictions that we have, the government restrictions on building in the US. It is insane how impossible it is to actually increase the supply. So there is
just a quick thing on that.
Yeah.
People forget that England is one of the most densely populated places in the world. We're not a very big country, and the United States is a continent. I'm not suggesting that one size fits all solution is for everyone or anything like that. The issue we have is our issue. And again, this is another problem with ideology. Because you can abstract it into a set of propositional doctrines, it can go anywhere and say, hey, I'm a thing, here's a few propositions, I should be applied. No, I'm not saying that what the issue for England should be and the solutions for England should be applied to the United States. Entirely a different context, right, and entirely a different set of issues, in fact. And the issues in the United States shouldn't be applied in England. Different context, different problems. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And also, I think the thing that's been irritating me the most lately about libertarianism is that so many people who believe in it are making it into something it was never meant to be. It was meant to give you guidelines on politics. It was not meant to be your philosophy of life. So what libertarianism is seeking to do is to establish what are the circumstances in which official violence would be justified. And it places a very, very high threshold on the answer. But it doesn't mean that I'm living a good life if I can say, well, I haven't committed violence against anybody. Because people will say, you've given examples already of choices people make that we have every right to be critical of. And I have some libertarians saying, I thought you were a libertarian. But wouldn't that include the right to be critical of people's choices? So it's like people's choices now become sacred. They're beyond criticism. Or people will say, well, I'm not violating the non-aggression principle. Okay, but you're a deadbeat, you're a bum, you're a liar, you're irresponsible, you're a terrible member of society, you're an ingrate. You have every bad quality, but yes, congratulations, you don't punch random people in the face. I'll give you a trophy for that. But like the fact that I have to explain that libertarianism does not give you a model for what it means to live a good life. That means that you are impoverished as a person if that is your entire philosophy. You look elsewhere for that. You look to your religious faith. You could look to Stoic philosophy if you want to. Look to something. Yep. But it can't just be, well, as long as I don't, murder random people, I'm morally unimpeachable. This is not how you would, I presume, teach your children to be good people. So this is my source of grief. We all know there are a lot of things broken in the United States. A lot. You don't need me to tell you that. And one of the brokenest is American healthcare and American health insurance. Have you ever said, my favorite part of being an American is my health insurance plan? American health insurance, we all know, is frustrating and expensive. Claims denials are becoming more common. And they had the nerve to pass something called the Affordable Care Act that only made your premiums go up. Well, that's why Crowd Health was created. It's not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for healthcare through crowdfunding. Because let's face it, your insurance policy is full of unpleasant surprises. Your premiums are going up every year. Crowd Health does things differently. For $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more without doctors' networks getting in the way. Let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com/woods. Crowd Health is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com/woods. That's joincrowdhealth.com/woods.
You're so right on this that you've just explained why the Libertarian Party conference is an embarrassment every year.
Now you're just killing me bringing that up. I don't want to talk about it.
Sorry, man. It's true though, isn't it? Come on.
No,
it's true.
I know. Look, and I think I have dear friends who have fought valiantly in this fight, and just on principle, because during the lockdown period, the Libertarian Party was so terrible, so unspeakably and unforgivably terrible on the issue of our time that could have finally catapulted them into some kind of relevance. And instead they would tweet about the problem of, it would be, we need to fix the problem of, civil asset forfeiture or something, which I agree. There are abuses there.
Yeah, that's a real problem. Yeah.
But this is not
locking us in our homes. This is an open goal for the libertarians at this point. They literally shut down every small business in Britain. They literally shut everything down. They were like, no, it's only mega corporations who have got direct government involvement who get to operate. And it's like, come on, libertarians, now's your time.
Now's the time.
You need to bring out that Magna Carta and be like, you see here,
Yeah, and it turns out that because look, I have many good, dear friends who have fought very valiantly on behalf of good, decent things, and for some reason, and I haven't quite figured out why. There must be some sociological explanation for it, but the worst people in the libertarian world are in the party by far. The worst people, and I have my theories about this, but I don't want to waste my bandwidth on it at the moment. But I'm curious, though, to ask you this. Now, I think over the past few years, or maybe even just the past year, it's really suddenly starting to build. There's been a sense on the part of what we might loosely call the dissident right, that maybe Christianity is kind of necessary after all. Because for a while, we went through a period where there were some people on the right who would say, I have kind of a respect for it because it's old and it's part of our identity in the West, but I like the consequences of it, but I don't really want to do it. And now there's more and more of a
Richard
sense.
Dawkins' position.
Yeah, it's true, but people who are not as snarky as he is also took the position. And I think that there's this sense, I think it's partly coming from a feeling that the level of evil that we are experiencing seems so bizarrely organized and effective, like it's an entity. It's not just a bunch of bad people. It's almost like an entity. It is making people take a second look at Christianity and thinking, maybe this actually is true. So I'm wondering, and I realize this is a very personal question. Where do you fall in that?
I wish I was religious. However, I was raised in the materialistic culture of Britain in the 80s and 90s, and my parents just never took me to church. Yeah. So I don't even have the nostalgic feeling for it. Right. To me, it's just it's not that I don't like church. I love the buildings, and I like watching the ceremonies, but I just don't have whatever it is in your heart that is like tuned to it. And so I don't feel the need to be religious. But I very much disagree with the idea of attacking our traditional religion, because I think you're exactly right. It's a good source for moral virtue. And the problem that we have in modern day, especially, in fact, much of the Anglosphere's 20th century philosophy is our best philosophers like Bernard Williams and various others arguing, okay, how do we ground morality in rationality? And the answer is you can't really, as far as the conclusions they came to, because you can always have a kind of Callicles style figure who comes out of one of Plato's dialogues, who essentially says, you know what, if you're going to try and rationally organize morality, I'm just going to repudiate it, deny it, and walk around and do evil. And all you can make all the arguments you want, but I can deny your premises. So there we go. And that essentially leads us to the point, well, that was the point of Christianity. It wasn't rational. It was God said, this is the origin point of morality. And essentially it puts it in an unquestionable position. And then the only question is, well, okay, how do we interpret what God's commandments were? And there are lots of people who, like you said earlier, feel that they ought to be the highest authority and the organizing principle of the universe. It's like, okay, but you aren't. You're actually subject to the universe. And actually, you're running around in a kind of insanely arrogant delusion about your position in the universe. And the sooner you learn a bit of humility and realize, okay, well, these ancient doctrines didn't last for 2,000 years for no reason. Actually, there was genuinely something wholesome and organic about it, and normal and natural and virtuous that Christianity contains. Even if you aren't a fan of the metaphysics of it because you are too rationalistic. And honestly, I'm kind of in that position, right? I'm not someone who believes in the stories of the Bible, but I have a deep sympathy for the lessons they're trying to impart. And I definitely endorse the lessons and the morality that the Bible is trying to bring to the civilizations that it's been applied to. And so it's just kind of crazy that, like the libertarian example, is like, okay, well, if your choice and not harming someone is the only thing that makes you good or bad, then yeah, you end up becoming the Libertarian Party. It's obvious that there is more to morality than this. And Christianity is a very good place for us to look for that.
What is it like being, again, I'm going to use this word dissident, but I think it's a good word. I think it really holds up well in the UK in particular.
Well, I mean, there's always the threat of the state arresting you and charging you and putting you in jail, like Tommy Robinson. And there's a chap called Joey Barton who's currently, he called a television presenter a naughty name. And now he's going to court and is going to be sued for something, defamation of some way. But really, it's only happening because he's a very prominent public dissident against the sort of woke orthodoxy. And so you always live with that sort of Damocles over your head. My goodness, do I envy the First Amendment? That's all I'm going to say. That. But otherwise, it's okay because, I mean, nothing terrible has happened so far, but you do definitely have to moderate the language you use in order to stay within a series of sort of progressive tripwires. Not that I tend to want to use language that's necessarily inappropriate or something like that, but you can definitely feel that you're treading on shaky ground, or you're like, look, are we sure that Islam is compatible with British values? Are we sure? And they'll say that, yeah, of course it is. It's like, okay, but what's the difference between Islamic values and British values? And if they're basically the same, are you sure that British values are something that Muhammad himself would sign off on? And the answer is, of course, no, of course he wouldn't. Of course they're not. And we're living in this kind of fiction because we don't want civil strife, basically. And this, with the Southport riots and the Southport murders, this boiled up, and you saw the fury with which the administrative state went after those rioters. Even though it turned out that they were essentially correct. The guy had been radicalized into Islam and stabbed a bunch of children, 3 of whom died. And so I think it was 3 of them that died. And So we've got a very protective state over the Muslim community and Islam as a doctrine, and it is very aggressive against Christianity. In this country, there are abortion clinics, and there have been Christians who have been arrested for praying inside their own heads. I'm not joking, within proximity of these abortion clinics. They didn't say anything, they didn't do anything, but the police would come over to them and say, "Are you praying in your head?" And they would say, "Maybe." And the police say, "Right, can you come with us then, please?" And they'd arrest them. It's crazy.
Hey everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you're getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you're a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. What if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? Well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking? Use your website as a lead generation engine. What if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO Expert Search Engine Optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help.
It's scary, frankly. It is genuinely a scary time. But obviously, I think that what I do is important, and I think it has to be done. I just try to be tactful and tactical. Try not to obviously cross any of the tripwires to continue advancing the message.
Well, I was thinking in particular about being in the U.S., and there are parts of the country where I can go. In fact, I live in one of them, where I can presume that maybe close to 60% of the people at least roughly, vaguely see the world the way I do. You know, like they couldn't write a treatise on it, and they haven't studied Edmund Burke, but their instincts are probably pretty sound. And then there are other parts of the country where I have to walk around assuming that if these people could murder me, they would.
Yeah.
And so I think to me, the most unhappy social trend, which I suppose has always been around, but has really intensified, is the existence of a very, very large plurality of my fellow people in this country who get all their opinions from the TV, who are highly suggestible, who would never dream of disagreeing with their favorite musician or actor, or they, who hold in the highest regard people who are obvious charlatans. And it's like there's just a permanent barrier between me and these people. And I guess my feeling is that that's even worse where you are, just based on polling data I've seen. And so it's alienating to walk around feeling like I'm in a different universe from people I see every day. And I don't think it was that way, let's say 75 years ago. I don't really think it was that way.
We actually know that it wasn't. The numbers are in. We know that people have radicalized, and the left far more than the right. The right has kind of retrenched itself in its core doctrines, in America in particular, actually, this is. Because the Republican doctrine is actually technically a liberal doctrine, but it's also the American tradition. And so it's easy for the Americans to fall back on a solid set of foundations. The difference in Britain is that we don't have that. What we have is essentially a very large extended family, and everyone kind of belongs to the family that has been, here for over 1,000 years. And it wasn't something rationally put together. It wasn't something that came in a doctrine. It was a habit of life that we inherited. And so there's an interesting difference there, which is in America, your radicals feel more dangerous. I look at American Antifa in the same sort of way I look at German Antifa, dangerous lunatics. Over here, Antifa are a bit embarrassing, kind of like the sort of rebellious teenager at a family barbecue who's stropping and looking for attention. You don't really think they're actually going to do anything because they've been born and raised in this country and they know that it's wrong. ideology aside, underneath it all, the habitual morality of humanity makes them understand that it's wrong. And so they're not really very scary. They're more annoying over here. And I've had a few encounters with them myself, and they've never done anything. They've never done anything, but I've seen a lot of things in America where they have, because there's less of a feeling of, there are less strong sentimental bonds between Americans than there are people in England. And so it's not as bad in that regard, I would say.
Can you tell us about Lotus Eaters?
I can. Lotus Eaters is a, I guess, conservative or post-liberal website that I founded about 4 years ago, because I wanted to create a kind of think tank to examine these issues. And so I hired a bunch of people who were very, very clever and had much better qualifications than I did to come and think about these issues professionally. And so we produce a lot of content. We produce sort of, popcorn content that goes on social media, but on the website itself, we produce long form, thoughtful analyses, debates, discussions, book reviews, things like that. And in the new year, we're going to have really, really high quality documentaries that we'll probably only be able to put out like 3 or 4 a year, but they're going to be so good. And they're going to be really diving deeply into a particular topic or issue. My one will be the first one. It's actually going to be about the way in which the Enlightenment's characterization of the universe essentially has killed God, raised man to be his own maker, and what will happen when man is his own maker. And we're on the cusp of that now. We're at the point where we can genetically engineer future generations. And suddenly C.S. Lewis's observations in the abolition of man are suddenly incredibly pertinent. So, oh no, the power of future generations, or past generations over future generations, is going to essentially in some way cripple these future generations. And without realizing what we're depriving them of now, they will have no capacity for what the previous generations took for granted. And religion is a great example. I'm very aware that I should feel religious. Right? I'm very aware of this. And I no doubt that if I'd been born and raised 50, 70 years ago, something like that, I would have been religious, and I would have been probably very much in the doctrine of Christianity. But because I was born and raised in the time that I was, I'm not. And I can feel that something has been withheld. And it's not my parents' fault or anything like that. They were people of their time. They were completely normal. It was just the zeitgeist. It's just what everyone at their age did. And so they weren't doing anything unusual. And they're just working class, they were young working class people when they had me. So, they didn't go to university. They didn't study any of this. It would be unreasonable to have expected them to have done otherwise. But we are still in the position where we are essentially whittling down the aspects of the human experience that we're passing on to future generations. And if that continues, well, eventually you're going to get very kind of stunted people who don't really have a very good grasp of the breadth and richness of what human life used to be. And this applies in everything. I mean, like, if you go back and read a book from 100 years ago, it's enchanting. The language they use is so much more broad, and it fills the space on the page. You know what I mean? It's like they'll use words that have multiple dimensions to them in the same word. Whereas now we tend to use more clinical language that's thinned out, that has a very definite, specific meaning. And again, go back and read Churchill and then read any modern historian like Tom Holland or something. Tom Holland's a perfectly good writer, but you'll notice that it's just not as rich an experience as when you're reading someone like Churchill or A.J.B. Taylor or whoever. And that's because if you look at modern texts now, we have a much higher percentage of Latin words that are used in just everyday English. Whereas if you go back, 60, 70, 80 years ago, we use many more Anglo-Saxon words. And the Anglo-Saxon words are often relational words that speak of a person, a place, a connection between them, and a moral judgment about the connection itself. So what happened between those people. And I actually did a little study on this a while ago. You can thank God for ChatGPT, right? It's really got its uses. And one of the uses is you can ask it to analyze a piece of text and tell you how many words in it are Latin etymology or Germanic etymology.
Wow.
And so it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And so if you take like George R.R. Martin and slap it in, he'll say, oh, it's about 50% Latin. He'll say it's about 50% Latin words. But if you put Tolkien in, he'll say, well, this is about 80% Anglo-Saxon words. And suddenly you realize, right, the language in the 20th century changed because of the advance of science. The scientific language is all in Latin, you'll notice, all Latin words that we use, like derived from Latin. And what this means is these are words that are artificial, right? They're not normal in human life. Like the Anglo-Saxon words are the ancient words that from the tribe. They're the words that speak to the lizard brain, the deep past of what it is to be a member of the English-speaking world. And that's why when you read one of these books from the Victorian era, you're just taken on this emotional and conceptual journey. Whereas when you read a book from modern day, it feels like you could be reading any kind of academic university text. It's very bland. It doesn't stir the soul. And you can, and if you go and actually look for this, now you're conscious of it, go and look for it, you suddenly see it's all around us. It's all around us. All of the words we use, and I do it myself, they're tepid. They're non-judgmental, abstract, objective words. It's like, okay, but nobody lives in that world. Like no human being lives in an objective world. You all live in subjective worlds in your head, through your eyes, using data through your senses, processed by your cultural matrix that is your consciousness. And that's why the Anglo-Saxon words sound romantic. That's why they sound heroic. That's why they make you feel like the world is actually kind of a magical thing. Whereas the scientific words make you feel small and insignificant and unimportant and disconnected from your fellow man. And again, it's such a subtle cultural shift that happens in the sort of latter half of the 20th century that nobody, I think, really understood what was happening and noticed it when it was going on. And yet here we are now where people have real trouble relating to one another because they don't have the words that were used. And a good example of this is like old children's authors, like Beatrix Potter and stuff like that, right? And what was the other one? What's the one with the bunnies, the bunny rabbits? Peter Rabbit. Who wrote that?
Oh, I should know that. I should know that. I read it. Kids, I should know that.
Yeah, I read it to my kids only a couple of years ago. But one of the funny things is how morally charged every sentence is. So, for example, the one that sticks out in my mind is like Peter Rabbit says, or someone says to Peter Rabbit, how do you feel like about this? And the reply is, well, I ought to feel like. And rather than saying, I do feel, he said, I ought to feel, which is a way of saying, this is how I feel, but this is how it's morally appropriate for me to feel as well. And so the very nature of the response is morally charged with a normative prescriptive judgment. Whereas if you say, well, I feel like this, that's not to say that's right or wrong. That's just to say this is objectively how I feel, whether it's good or bad. But there's a whole matrix of moral judgments and presuppositions behind, oh, I ought to feel this way, that have just fallen out of the culture completely. The sort of moral bottom has just fallen out of our culture and it's all drained out. And so now we get these flat, objective characterizations that don't bring you into the richness of a judgmental world to find a place for yourself in it. And it's a fascinating thing I'm just kind of obsessed with, because as soon as you start seeing it, you start seeing it everywhere.
I think there's an analogous case when it comes to things like biblical translations, because there are verses that we all know just from cultural literacy. Like, what does it profit a man if he gain the whole world but lose his soul? Has now become, what good is it if you get what you want but destroy yourself in the process? Wait, what? So the word soul is gone.
Yes.
Gone. And it's interesting. I know I dwell on this, but this is because this is a pet thing of mine, because I'm very much an opponent of the Catholic liturgical changes, because they were just disastrous on every level. And they're disastrous in language as well, because they're bringing.
When were they made?
At the pinnacle of human existence, 1969.
You know, that's really interesting, because I think it is during the 60s where you get this essentially kind of liberal cultural revolution that sweeps across the West. And this is where language begins to mutate, I think. I think if you read anything before about 1960, it's in the sort of old, rich style. And then everything afterwards, you can feel the judgment, the morality embedded in it kind of draining out of it. And the scientific objective language comes in. And that's interesting, very interesting.
Yeah. And it's also the mass becomes more didactic rather than mystical. Because it's interesting, even like what time do you have to arrive at mass for it to be considered legitimate? Like you can be a little late and it still satisfies your requirement. But the one area where the modern church is a little tougher than the traditional churches, you have to be at the mass earlier. And you think, oh, they're getting tough on one thing. It's because they're I know this will scandalize my Protestant brethren, but it's because they're privileging the preaching, the didactic aspect. You have to be there in time for that. Whereas in the old mass, you had to be there in time for the offertory, which is when we prepare to offer the sacrifice. So those aspects are played down. And in the language, in the old mass, there was plenty of reference to, we're under siege by the forces of evil. We have enemies. There are no enemies in the modern liturgy. Why would there be? Because Catholicism is just about being nice to people. Why would we have enemies? So all the stuff that made it the sorts of the kind of faith that would generate a Tolkien the life has been sucked out of it. And also the very attitude of, we have this ancient text that for mass that has evolved over 2,000 years, but what it really needs is a good editor. It needs a red pen so that we can get rid of all these stupid, pointless duplications. Why are we saying this thing 3 times? We don't need to do that. We can just be clinical and say it once. I mean, so it's the kind of things that drive you crazy, drive me crazy.
No, I think you're so on the money with this as well. And the word you used, the mysticism of it, that's important, man. Because again, it's non-rational, right? The problem with the Enlightenment itself, liberalism, science, and everything that's come afterwards, it's all predicated on rational foundations, as in it will pick a couple of principles, premises, and say, right, we need to extrapolate from this. Well, a mystical worldview doesn't mean a worldview that doesn't map onto reality. What it means is a non-rational worldview. So it's a felt experience of the universe. And that doesn't mean it doesn't map onto reality. That doesn't mean it's not predictive, although it might not be technically descriptive of the processes in place. So for example, if the ancient Greeks are like, well, Helios is driving his chariot across the sky. Yeah, and that's correct in a way, as in it's going there, what happens when he goes into the underworld and fights with Hades or whatever. I don't actually know what he does during the night. But the point is, it predicts the day-night cycle, and then it predicts the procession of the seasons and things like this. And so it's not that they don't have an accurate description of what's happening. It's just not scientifically correct. And it's like, okay, well, that's great. But the scientific correctness of it liberates us from the nature of the universe. Well, we think it liberates us from the nature of the universe. And we're seeing this with all kinds of science experiments gone wrong, for example, where we think, okay, well, if that does that, then we can just do that. And we're not cognizant of the fact that there are going to be a bunch of downstream knock-on effects from this that we don't have the humility to stop on and say, okay, even if that did do that, we don't know enough about this. And you see this in science all the time. It's like, no, we've done 5 studies and it turns out that does that, and that's fine. That, no one died, it's perfectly safe. It's like, okay, but you don't know what's going to happen in 20 years' time. You don't know what's going to, and the thalidomide scandal is just one of those things where it's like, this is crazy that this was possible. It was possible that this could happen, especially given how they did know that it caused deformities in rats and stuff like this. But anyway, the point being, it's not the first time, like the COVID thing, it's not the first time that the scientists have said, well, we've established this and therefore that's all we need to know. It's like, no, that's very arrogant, and there's going to be a whole number of downstream effects that we're not sure of. And if we had a more mystical view of the universe, we would treat things as if they were sacred, as if there is a lot to this we don't understand. And really, I mean, like an honest physicist will say, well, we don't really understand how the universe works. An honest scientist will say this. But the problem is we're churning out like midwit after midwit out of these diploma mills who are like, well, I mean, I got an A on my exam and therefore I must understand it. It's like,
and therefore the universe is a machine,
That's exactly what I'm going to talk about in the first documentary I'm making, is the clockwork view of the universe is very deceptive, but it gives us a certain measure of power, but we don't understand what that does on the downstream effects. And it means that we desacralize the universe. when things were sacred, when things were mystic, we were actually, I think, happier because we had a spiritual connection to everything around us. Right now, everything around us is just matter, and it's like, okay, well, I don't care about any of these things, and we've got to the point where human beings themselves just matter. It's like, okay, well, we can just get abortions then, can't we? Oh yeah, brilliant. We have hundreds of thousands of abortions a year. I'm not sure I'm up for that, actually. And I say that as an atheist. I think that might be a little bit demonic, actually. Maybe a bit of personal virtue to prevent the need for those abortions, just like your grandmother would have understood, may actually be the correct way of approaching the issue. Or maybe you should think about not having sex with people you don't want to have babies with. I don't want to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but there's a reason that they had these moral standards in the first place. And if it comes from the universe being a bit mystical to prevent what are otherwise quite horrific things that we do in the modern era, again, industrialized abortion. Like the Democrats had an mobile abortion clinic at their bloody rallies in America. It's like, that is unbelievable. Like, yeah, this is a clinic. This is literally, if you're a pregnant woman and you want to kill your baby, this is part of our political platform. So, okay, that is wild. That we are so far off the moral path at this point. Anyway, I know I'm going on one. But
I look. I mean, we would have a lot of beers together if I were.
Oh yeah, definitely. Because there's so much about this that's true, and the religious types. The problem, the reason we can't hear them is because they're speaking in a language that the secular types like myself don't understand. Right, like the average college student who's has their brain formatted into materialism long before they get to university. All of the culture is purely mechanical, purely materialist, desacralized. By the time they get to university and are given enough technical knowledge to understand the mechanics of how the universe works, to the limited extent that people understand it, when the priest says, right, okay, what if the universe has a plan for you? They can't even understand what he means, right?
Yeah.
But it's definitely true, and like the ancient Greeks knew this. All ancient wisdom literature is essentially the same. Like I had a bit of a phase where I was just like, no, I'm going to find every single ancient piece of wisdom literature that I can find. And you can go back to literally the ancient Akkadians. There's a great text called The Advice of an Akkadian Father to His Son. This must be about 4,500 years old, one of the earliest things mankind has ever written. And it's all the advice I gave to my sons. It's don't cause trouble in the market. Be diligent about your jobs and your duties. Honor thy father and thy mother. Be kind. Be thoughtful. Work hard. Do your duty. It's all. And don't be hasty. Don't get into fights. Don't get into arguments where you don't need to. Be prudent. Be temperate. And then you go through literally everything. Go through the Greeks, and then there's an Anglo-Saxon poem called The Wanderer, which I'm actually, again, doing a big study on. And this is an elegy for the Anglo-Saxons during the Viking raids. It's clearly written during the Viking raids, and everything's going terrible. And this Anglo-Saxon warrior has had his family and kin murdered by the Vikings, and he's sailing on the seas on his own. And he just sits there darkly contemplating how tragic the world is. And then towards the end of the poem, he just sits there and goes, right, okay, what makes a good man? And he says, well, a good man mustn't move too swiftly. He mustn't be too weak. He mustn't speak before his thoughts. He mustn't commit in haste to an oath. He must be temperate. He must be, and suddenly he just sounds like Aristotle. There's no way that this Anglo-Saxon warrior would have known who Aristotle was. It's just these are timeless, universal truths. In what C.S. Lewis had a great term for it in The Abolition Man. He called it the Tao, right, or the Tao, which is, and he had a great definition for it. He was like, look, it is objectively true with what the universe is in relation to what we are. So it's not that it's universally true for all things in all times and all places, but considering what a human is in the world he's in, this kind of wisdom literature always finds itself landing on moderation and temperance and virtue for a reason. This is what makes a good human life. And again, it's over every religion, literally every religion comes back to the just be reasonable, be moderate, be good, don't go crazy on something. And we've completely forgotten that lesson.
Yeah, and it's at the end. I don't know if it is. Is it that book where he actually lists them? He actually goes through and he quotes from sacred sources
Oh yeah, he does. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and so
absolutely.
like in case you needed to know what
he
it
does.
is to be a good person, there it is. He's got them all there.
Yeah, he does. He absolutely does. And it's wild how we are so arrogant as to think these things aren't important in the modern day.
Or they're kind of passé or old fashioned.
Progress. We're on. Like crazy. It's absolutely mad. We wonder why people are so miserable. Sorry, go on.
There's an old TV show in the US that I love very much that occasionally I catch in reruns, black and white from the 1950s, and it's called What's My Line? And it's a panel, and they have to guess the occupation of the contestant who answers only in yes or no questions. And sometimes the contestant will have a bizarre occupation, and it makes for a very enjoyable program. Well, one of the people on that panel is Bennett Cerf, who was I believe the founder and editor of Random House Publishing. Big publishing house, of course. And Bennett Cerf was, by the standard of his day and age, he was a left liberal, but which meant he would have voted for Adlai Stevenson over Dwight Eisenhower. But I mean, that was the 1950s. But he was suave, debonair, well-dressed, well-spoken, charming, elegant. It would never occur to him to speak in a gutter sort of way, to be discourteous toward anyone. He actually worked with Ayn Rand. And in his memoir, he says, look, she has a completely cockamamie philosophy, but I could listen to her expound on it all day because I found her a fascinating woman. You just don't see a man with a capacious mind like this, who's that generous of soul and happy of spirit. And yet he was on what was considered the left in those days. And that's the America I feel like I just want that. Is that so wrong? I want to live in that America.
I agree with you so much on this. And one of the bad habits that I've got is watching political debates from like the 1960s, where you've got sort of Enoch Powell and Jonathan Miller on the Dick Cavett show, and they're having a political debate, and it is an eloquent, philosophical, deeply thought out position that each one presents, and then they actually interrogate each other's points. And I'm like, my God, we just don't have anything like this. The quality of the people has gone down. The educational system has been like, have you ever seen an exam paper from like, the 1890s or something for like 14-year-olds? I'm looking at it like, okay, I would need to do a lot of studying to be able to do this exam.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And the educational standards have gone down severely. And, we in the modern world, I mean, they weren't great when I was at school. I went to sort of British state schools. So, God only knows what they're going to be like for my grandchildren. You know what I mean? And so this is another reason we do so much intellectual labor at Lotus Eaters, where it's like we just read books a lot and then try to explain people, look, this is what you need to know. And we're actually going to start thinking about like trying to revive a classical education for people and say, okay, what did actually people learn? Well, I mean, they learned Greek and Latin. I never had the opportunity to learn Latin. I would have hated it when I was a kid. But who knows? And it's not about knowing Latin that's the important bit. I mean, one of the things that always drives me crazy is if you go back like 200 years, when an Englishman arrived on a foreign continent, it was something of note, right? Because an English aristocrat, he had the ability to speak Latin and Greek, and it wasn't the fact that he could understand these languages that was important. It was the fact that getting to the point where he could read Latin and Greek meant that he had to read Aristotle, he had to read Plato, he had to read Cicero, he had to read Caesar, he had to read all of this great ancient literature, and you can't help but imbibe all of these lessons. And so you have this breadth of learning that we just don't have anymore, that have just been deprived of people now. And so this gave them a much deeper and richer and more complex understanding of the world. And it was the same for Americans. It was the same for Americans, the same for everyone in basically the Western world. Like a well-educated professor, if you go back like 80 years and watch an interview with any professor from like that sort of time period, you realize, oh, they're way smarter than our professors now. And they're way more respectful of what they know and what they don't know. They're more respectful of the limits of their own knowledge and their own ability, and the possibility that the other chap they're talking to knows something they don't. Like you say, like the church has become very didactic now. Well, education has become very didactic as well. And our professors are exactly like that. And it's the pulpit of authority that they seem to be enchanted with, rather than actually having a stimulating interaction on this subject.
Well, I'll let you go after this, but when I was in graduate school, I was getting a PhD in U.S. history, but I thought I should know some Latin as an educated person. So I took intensive Latin, which counts as 2 courses in one. And my academic advisor, who was a distinguished Columbia professor, strongly urged me against this. And I said, but look, I'm not married. I have no kids. I have all the time in the world. I have no responsibilities. This is the only time in my life I'll ever have this opportunity. So I overrode him and went ahead and did it. And I assure you, I was the only U.S. historian in that class. The professor didn't even understand what I was doing in there. And I thought, but that's sad that you don't understand what I'm doing in here.
That's crazy.
You know?
Why did he try and dissuade you?
It was that I should be focusing on the core of my studies. But I assured him I could do both.
Yeah.
I'm a very hardworking person. And now I will tell you, though, Carl, I will tell you that year I would work until I saw the sun come up.
Yeah.
And I would go to my classes and then I'd come back home and sleep. I mean, it was hard, but doggone it, I did it.
Well done.
All right.
Like I said, I was the generation that grew up after they'd stopped teaching Latin in schools. And I know I would have hated it, but I really should have. I wish I'd done it.
I would have hated it if it had been, in middle school or high school.
Yeah.
But by the time I was old enough to get why it mattered, I actually kind of liked it, but geez, I'm glad I speak English though. I mean, Latin is it is a tough language. I don't want to hear anybody complaining about learning Spanish or French compared to Latin. So anyway, lotuseaters.com. Let me recommend that to people, lotuseaters.com. And then you're all over social media and you do, you have remarkable reach on X and on YouTube. So it's not difficult to find Carl Benjamin. But if there's any other link you'd like to promote, feel free to do that.
No, that's basically, the best of the stuff that we do. So come and check us out, basically.
All right. Well, Carl, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.